Laba diena! Today I'm going to be making a custom night lamp for Timothy. Timothy is a blacksmith.
Tim the blacksmith, welcome here. It is awesome to have you here.
And he makes wonderful axes and astonishing bottle openers. I bought one and I instantly knew I want to make a lamp out of it. The problem is that now I realize that I should have filmed this intro before pouring an epoxy all over it. Well, it is what it is now. And there's a bit of a story about this bottle. So in one of the videos, Timothy mentioned that Doritos Mandarin is the drink of his choice. So I knew I want to put it into the casting, but once I googled about the brand, it appears that it's a Mexican brand, and it was a bit of a tricky task to get it here in Lithuania. But here it is. Well, I suggest we go through the building process up to this point. The very first task to tackle was to cut the glass bottle, and you may already know that glass is hard and fragile, so it was no easy task. Plus, I decided to add the bottle at the angle so the composition would look a bit more dynamic. So this black box I'm using is exactly the same size as the casting will be, so it was perfect for scribing the line. And I used just a regular glass cutter for this task. Once I had this line established, I remembered a trick with heat and water, so I thought to give it a shot, but it didn't end up well. I believe, I'm not sure, the shock was too big or the glass was too brittle, so it just shattered. Fortunately though, I was smart enough to buy more than one bottle of Doritos, so I popped the second one, emptied it up, and this time I made sure to replace the glass scribing wheel with a brand new one, so the scribe line ended up being a lot crispier and deeper, and I believe that helped tremendously. Plus, I decided not to use too much water this time, and I basically applied only heat, and I watched the scribe line really carefully, and it ended up being quite a crisp cut, if you will. But even with that success, the break line of the glass wasn't on point, so I had a lot of sanding to do. Fortunately, or should I say unfortunately, I had a broken or teared white belt sander belt laying around, so I used it for sanding, and even though it's designed for wood and it was getting dull really quickly, I had plenty of it, so I used it all. And after about a couple of hours of intense sanding, I finally got the bottle to the shape I wanted, and I was able to move to the next step, which is to cap the bottom of the casting and place the sponge underneath. Well, even though it doesn't make any sense, but I will try to explain the idea. So if you place a porous material in the epoxy and it overheats with rapid expansion, it pushes the air from the porous material upward, and the air bubbles get trapped in the epoxy. So that's why I wanted a sponge underneath that white cap with a hole directly underneath the bottle neck, so the air would only funnel through the bottle, creating that sizzling effect, if you will. I hope that makes some sense. Well, I realized I might have another problem with the glass. You see, when clear glass is placed in the water, or in this case in epoxy, it dissolves. Not in a literal sense, but you are not able to see the shape of it because of the similar transparency. So I looked through my storage and I found this reflective spray. So I thoroughly cleaned the glass and applied a very thin coat of this spray on the glass. Even though it created a bit of a frosty effect on the glass, I was okay with that, and the main effect appeared only when the light was lit. And the next steps were as explained. I got some foam, some sponge, I placed it on the bottom. I checked if everything fits okay, and then I decided to mix some of the fast hardening epoxy just to coat the glass and the bottom, because once I will place this long setting epoxy all over it, I wanted to be sure that that reflective spray wouldn't be washed away or dissolve in the epoxy. So that's just a safety precaution. Once the epoxy hardened, now I had to create the composition and place two more objects into the casting, the bottle cap as well as the bottle opener, of course. And it was a bit of a tricky task because of the weight of the bottle opener. As you may know already, that it's made of steel and it's quite heavy, and I wanted it to float in mid-air. So the first idea was to glue some fishing line, but it just didn't work because it was too heavy, and the glue I was using wasn't holding onto the metal, or the fishing line was snapping, and I didn't want to use the thick fishing line because it would be very visible. So eventually I decided to switch to magnets. So I glued the cap directly into the bottle opener, and then suspended the bottle opener in mid-air with some magnets. So I had a couple of criteria while making the composition, first being that it had to look somewhat like a stopped motion, like it's still moving but it's just frozen in this very second. And the second, not to neglect the branding, the logos, so those would be visible as well. And at last the time came to mix the epoxy, and for this task I'm using deep pore epoxy, and here you see me using a filter because there was some debris in the epoxy. Well, anyway, once I mixed the right amount of epoxy, I poured a little amount into the cup and dyed it with a similar color as the drink was, just because I wanted to fill the bottleneck with a different color. I made a very simple funnel from a piece of paper and filled the bottleneck with that orange colored epoxy, and the rest with the clear epoxy. And now the magic began. I will try to quickly explain what's happening here, even though it doesn't look like much. So after a while, epoxy starts to rapidly heat up and expand a bit, and that creates a lot of bubbles inside the epoxy. And on the same time, epoxy starts to cure really quickly and eventually trap those bubbles in the casting. And even though it's not the right way to use the epoxy, I absolutely love the effect it creates. And here's the moment I failed a bit. I removed the magnets while the casting was already cured but still very hot, and I decided I want to fill it with the leftover epoxy, just to fill that void from where the magnets were holding the bottle opener. And it was a mistake. Well, it was actually a learning experience because I didn't know this will happen, but the metal heated up that tiny amount of epoxy I poured just now, and it ended up being like opaque, so I had to remove it. Anyway, this is the next day and the casting is completely cured and hardened, so it's time to remove it from the box, and it ended up really well, apart from that tiny spot where the magnets were placed. So now I am removing all the mold release residue and basically making this this casting a bit more uniform, so I would be able to trim the ends with the saw. Usually this step is fairly simple, but this time it was a bit nerve-wracking because I knew there's a chunk of metal somewhere in the casting. But I went slow and it ended up being fine. And now it's time for the most exciting part of the build, which is sanding. And I need to sand it to 600, maybe up to the 1000 grit in order to retain that transparency in the next casting. And just to make things even more fun, I had to remove that opaque section of epoxy from the top, so I used some carving chisels and I went really slow not to hit the metal. At last this patience exercise was over, so I'm moving to the next step. I'm gluing this thin section of 80 by 80 mil tubing onto the bottom of the casting, so I would be able to attach the magnets and suspend the casting in mid-air in the silicone mold I'm using now. And that metal ring is beneficial not only for this task but also once the casting is done, because I'm attaching the base with the light using the magnets as well. And the silicone mold I created is designed to be 3 to 4 millimeters bigger than the casting I placed in, just to form even film around the whole casting to fill all of the open bubbles, cracks, and eventually create the fine polished surface right off of the silicone sleeve. All is left to do at this point is remove the epoxy overflow with the sander until I reach the metal ring, and the casting is basically finished. The casting is finished and now I have to make a base for it. Actually, I have quite a few bases prepped from the previous builds. I tend to batch produce these because it's more time efficient. Well, anyway, I checked which color looks best with this casting, and I feel like walnut is not dark enough for this design, and walnut is already the darkest one I have. I would like it to be almost black, so it would complement for the metal inside the casting. So my idea is to use one of these finished bases and stain it black. Most of the bases I made are already finished with lacquer, so the first task was to remove the lacquer so I would be able to stain it well. And of course there was a little bit of hand sanding after the belt sander because the finish was not even and a bit rough. At this point I decided to ebonize the walnut base instead of just staining it, just because ebonizing creates that different, a lot richer wood effect. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it looks so great. Anyhow, once the sides were dark, I had to seal it with some lacquer again. So I'm in my painting booth mixing some polyurethane lacquer, just the same one I used before, and I applied a couple of fine coats onto the base and it was done. Well, almost. I still had to install the magnets and add all of the electrical components. Now it's done. Sincerely thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye bye!
you.